Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and welcome to today's episode of the Art of Procurement. And today is the first in a two-part series that's really taking a look at category management and what we can do to not only implement category management, but also do it in a way that's sustainable over the long term. And the reason that I think that's important is that often I've seen category management implemented for the right reasons, but then after that initial burst of energy and kind of getting benefits from attacking the low-hanging fruit, it becomes difficult to keep the momentum going and provide value in other ways over a sustained and a long period of time. And today's guests on the show are Lynn Rideout, who is a Senior Manager of Category Management, and also Chris Eyerman, a Senior Director of Program Management, both at Denali Sourcing Services. I was delighted to welcome Lynn and Chris onto the show, and actually on a personal level, it was nice to get the chance to speak to Lynn again. Lynn is somebody that I've known for some time, and we both actually used to work in previous roles for the same company a couple of years ago. And so while we recorded this as one show, I actually decided to split it into two different episodes, and there were a couple of reasons that I did this. One is that we had a pretty in-depth conversation, and actually by the time we'd finished talking, it clocked in at well over an hour. And the second reason, though, is that there were actually two very distinct sides to the conversation. So we started talking about organizational building blocks. So what can the procurement leader do to enable longevity in a category management program? And then we shifted towards the category manager perspective. So what as a category manager are some of the imperatives for you as you seek to have as big an impact as possible on your stakeholders in the category that you're managing? So it just made sense to split it into two. And today we're going to focus on the organizational perspective. Then next episode, that's going to go out in a couple of days. We'll switch gear and take a look at things from the category manager's perspective. So with that in mind, let's go straight into the first part of the discussion. So hi there everybody, and welcome to today's episode of The Art of Procurement. And today on the show, I'm joined by two guests, Lynn Rideout and Chris Eyerman of Denali Sourcing Services. So Lynn and Chris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for having us.
Well, no, thanks for joining me. And, before we actually get into the crux of the conversation, I'd just love if you could just give a little bit of a background on yourself. And I'll start with Lynn, if you could just provide listeners with a little bit of an overview about who you are.
Sure, I'm happy to. So Lynn Rideout, I lead category management here at Denali. I've been part of Denali for several years now, but have 16 years of procurement client delivery experience that I've brought with me to Denali.
Mm-hmm. And Chris?
Yeah, thanks. Chris Eyerman, I lead program management, which is where we lead and execute our client engagements for our procurement services and category management. I've been in the space for about 17 years now. My background prior to that is engineering, where I used to design and launch satellites. But as we know, all roads lead to procurement, right, Phil?
Right. And actually, when I look at your backgrounds, you've got very similar backgrounds to what I have as well in terms of, working in the procurement services space. And so what we wanted to talk about was category management. Category management is one of those things that I think is... Everybody knows the term, but not necessarily everybody knows what it truly really means and how it forms part of both procurement from a strategic perspective. But, also from how we can take category management at its most basic level and actually make it a bigger part of our organizations, a bigger part of our procurement organizations. So that's really what I wanted to focus on today. And the first question that I had around it is, and I ask this because I was actually having a conversation with somebody on another interview a couple of days ago, and they made a comment that category management means different things to different people. So I was interested if you could define, what category management means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a good question. I think it's often one that we have to align with people we're talking to about it, because we certainly have experienced that it does mean different things to different people. So when we talk about category management, we're really looking at making sure that from all of the tasks and various pieces that we do in procurement, that we're really approaching it from aligning to the company's vision and the company's business objectives, and kind of marrying that or matching that with what's going on in the market and what do we know about the market from a procurement standpoint to think about long-range value, to think about what is our plan for the category, and then make sure that it's aligned with the business and meeting the business needs.
So do you consider it as a tool, or is it more of a methodology and a mindset around what your strategic procurement capabilities should be built?
I think it's all of those pieces. I think it's first and foremost having the right methodology and mindset. So, we understand what category management means, and we understand just all of the pieces it's going to touch and how procurement plays with respect to having that category management mindset. But then you obviously need, you need the tools, the processes, kind of the specific, this is what we need to do to really enable that and to make it flow and to keep it consistent across the organization.
So then, as we start to think about what category management is, you talked about a number of different layers, that it's both a process, but it's also, to do with vision and strategy. So I wonder if you could just give an idea of kind of what building blocks go into the formulation of category management.
Yeah, and I think this is important to mention. I mean, thinking about building on what Lynn had talked about, when you think about category management, really the way that we would approach it is really as a fundamental shift to the way organizations do procurement. So it's not just an additional process piece that you're appending to a sourcing process. It's not just a strategy that gets done and sits on the shelf. It really is something that has to permeate all the dimensions of the organization. And I think because of that, you really need to look at a variety of different building blocks. And we think of those really in three areas. And we might just spend a few minutes here talking about each of those three areas. So the first would be, what maybe people would think of most naturally, which is the category management process, right? So what's the methodology? What are the tools and the templates that you use to develop a strategy, to build out a plan that then will help you to realize that strategy? So that's a very core piece of that. And we would typically make sure that would incorporate a pretty robust combination of a full internal assessment. So you're really looking at clearly your business requirements, looking at your stakeholders in a comprehensive way and building out a stakeholder map and plan, scoping the category, doing the appropriate data analytics, et cetera. So getting a very robust look at the internal view of the category, together with a pretty comprehensive view of the external assessment. So everyone's familiar with doing market analysis, understanding the market, but really getting from that what are the key insights, key drivers that are going to be fundamental to your strategy, but also looking at the key risk drivers, both at the category and supplier level, looking at your current contract situation and what your contract strategy should be, your supplier, your current supply base, benchmarks, other elements that are going to help you now get a good look at the external market. And then bringing all that together to then generate strategic options, synthesizing that down to a good, well-defined vision and strategy for your category, and then planning out, doing the detailed planning phase of that, which is developing the portfolio of projects and activities that are going to then help you drive that through the source to pay cycle and realize your strategy.
Right.
Okay, so that's a good, robust category management process, and really why it's critical is that you want to have a process that's going to guide your category managers, but also challenge them to think broadly about their categories, regardless of their state of maturity, regardless of the category across the organization. And having that consistency across the organization is really critical. Establishing a common language, not just within your procurement organization, but how you engage with stakeholders, and how you interact with the organization and do the long-range planning that's going to align the whole organization to your new methodology.
And those have to be done at the executive level, so that they're kind of set as part of a strategy or part of a direction. It's not necessarily something that it should be on a category manager to have to come up with that, because, as you say, you're wanting to bring consistency.
Absolutely, and this applies across. So this methodology is applied at the category level and the category manager level. But really, the next piece of that, I think you're leading into some of the some of the governance or more direction-setting elements. So it's kind of the second big area that we find absolutely critical, and probably an area that many organizations tend to neglect a little bit. But you think about, what are the elements of good governance? Well, you want to have a vision for where you're going, and that's really more than saying, boy, we want to be a world-class category management organization, right? That's motherhood, right? That doesn't really tell you the details of what that means. So I think we try to work with our clients to put some good definition to that in terms of what are the details of where you want to be from a category manager competency standpoint, from an organization standpoint, from a process and a category maturity standpoint. And then along with that, having a category roadmap. So how are you going to get there? What's the path from today to that vision? And that's a really critical element that we found is important to be able to kind of be a foundational piece for your change management program. Because if the organization, especially in procurement team, but also the broader organization, doesn't know where you're going and kind of what the clear expectations are year over year in those areas, it's going to be very difficult to kind of get the organization aligned on taking those key steps. So change management is obviously critical to having a good, robust change management program, as well as other elements. We talked about the business planning integration. So evolving your category management processes where it becomes a natural tie point with your stakeholders, where you're co-developing your business plans and your business targets that are then cast down to the organization, including procurement and the category management team. There are other elements that you can include there to help better formally manage your categories, like category councils, to better help kind of integrate the business stakeholders in a formal way beyond how you're developing your categories together with them. So these are, think about these elements that provide the structure, kind of the regulation, and really drive that accountability across the organization that really makes category management embedded within the organization and sustainable.
See, there's a couple of things that you talked about. You talked about category councils. You talked about, embedding this in the organization. From your experience, how involved have, outside of procurement, the stakeholder groups, and even executives at the C-suite, how involved are they in the governance program, at least for those who are successful in implementing category management versus those that may be having a little bit more difficulty getting it off the ground?
Yeah, well, that's going to be, any organization, even who's starting into a formal category management, is going to be starting in a variety of different ways based on the category. Clearly, your more direct materials categories are going to have more natural integration points to, say, engineering, for example, if you're a manufacturing organization. Whereas on the indirect side, you probably tend to find that a lot more fragmented. As Lynn pointed out from the beginning, the stakeholder engagement and collaboration is critical. It's paramount to developing a good category plan. So these aren't developed in a vacuum. Certainly, there's work that the category managers do separate from the stakeholders, but all of the elements of a good plan, really should be developed in collaboration. As far as the formal governance of the category plans, we found that the concept of category councils can be very powerful, and that can take a variety of different forms. They can be, the most strategic of those tend to be very formal, where you have the senior level executives across the business units and the functional areas that are represented in that category sit at the table, maybe in a quarterly meeting, and are providing that direction setting and support with the resource to support the category plan and the execution of that strategy. The category councils can be much less formal than that and focused on a regional or even a plant level basis if needed.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I've actually done some work on governance and using governance as a way, not as a compliance tool, but as a way to actually engage and inspire folks within the business to actually participate in a category management process, as opposed to them just seeing it as being something that they have to do. I was interested, how do you convince executives, stakeholder executives, that they should play a role in this process? Because oftentimes they don't want anything to do with it. So there's a lot of change management that has to go into making them recognize that, this is here to stay, but it's also a value for them.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's change management. It's going to depend on the situation in terms of how difficult that is to get their support. Part of a good communication plan is having a compelling story that you're conveying to the business. That applies at the category level, but even on when trying to sell category management to the organization. You need to sell them on the value proposition. You need to sell them on the vision that this is going to be better for them and help better realize their business objectives, which is really what category management is all about. It's less about procurement meeting independent objectives and more about getting procurement aligned with supporting the business's objectives.
Right. And I think that's something that we sometimes lose sight of. We set out to achieve our own objectives first, rather than really take a step back and think, what is the business trying to get out of this? How can we actually help them achieve what it is that they need to achieve to help the business go forward in whichever way it is that they bring value to the organization? We want to be an enabler of that, rather than trying to do it in our own way and maybe to meet our own objectives, but not really considering what it is that they need from us.
I think I think oftentimes it's difficult to break out of traditional roles or the way maybe things have been done historically, where we have been a little bit siloed to say, this is my role as procurement, and these are the things that I need to execute on, and the business has been used to their role where procurement comes knocking at the door, and it's, okay, you're here to get your procurement objectives met. I think it's a difficult change management path, but certainly achievable to start to change the nature of that relationship, and for procurement to approach the business much more in the spirit of, what are your objectives, and then let's come up with a meaningful plan for procurement to help you. Sometimes that can be a top-down approach if an organization is ready for it and the right change agents exist, that you can really drive that message very consistently and simultaneously across the organization. Sometimes it's a harder battle where you have to get some of those small wins where you're changing an individual stakeholder or an individual group that's ready and receptive or has a specific set of challenges or pressures that they're under, and you can start to drive the wins that way. Obviously, one way is a little bit easier than the other, but both with the right consistency and mindset can really drive some optimal results for the business.
So we talked about the core processes. The first element, we talked about the governance and the decision-making pieces of it. The third component that we typically think of is category manager competency and other enablers. So the first piece of that is the competency of your category managers, and it's very important to think about the category management really as a discipline within the organization. It's not a one-time training. It's not a hey, here's the process guide. Let's just collect what we've been doing today and organize it in a different way. Organizations really need to think about this as a discipline. And so what that means is certainly formalized training is a key part of that. And we've seen that with a lot of organizations, but it can't end there. You can't just do a formal training and expect the organization to just adopt it, expect your category managers to internalize it and understand it. Anybody who works in HR performance development knows that. Application has to be a huge part of it. So we would typically recommend that on the heels of training, that organizations implement some aggressive goals for the category managers, that everyone's got to get on the methodology and start developing strategies, and to augment that with coaching. Typically one-on-one coaching, so that first time through, at least every category manager is going through the methodology, kind of getting a closer view of the nuances of each part of the methodology and understanding, how it applies to their categories. That should be ongoing too. That ongoing training, annual training is very common. Weaving in some targeted skills development. So we found in organizations as they go along, they might find, boy, we're developing good strategies, that's coming along, but this kind of selling the story to stakeholders and telling compelling stories is kind of a weakness we have. So let's kind of put together a targeted training around storytelling and business case development, for example. So really, in the end, you need to kind of approach it as a robust, multi-year approach to the competency development.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of organizations that implement category management for the first time, it's not that they have a stable of category managers at their disposal to slot into those roles. And so, I know from personal experience, I was in an organization that switched over to category management. Before that, we were just all full service buyers. And it was a little bit of a case of, well, we'll just put these individuals who are good buyers in category management roles and hope that it all works out. How do you recommend, or what guidance would you give to procurement leaders who are looking at implementing category management for the first time, and they're needing to use, existing employees to put them into roles? What are some of the things that they should look for in terms of, the professionals who would probably have the best chance of succeeding, at least in the short term, until some of that learning and development can kind of kick in and hone some of the capabilities?
I'll answer, Lynn, and let you jump in as well. But so that's a good question. I think there's nothing wrong with pulling employees from different roles to head towards category management. I would say the first thing that's very important is just recognize the different skill sets that are involved. When you look at certainly the buying activity and even a lot of sourcing and contract work, it tends to be very operational, kind of very project-based. Category management, by its nature, is more of a planning activity, more strategic. So strategic planning, analytics capabilities, and skill sets, and even more importantly, it becomes what becomes absolutely critical is your stakeholder relationship and relationship management skills. I've already mentioned sales skills and storytelling also become critical. Your consultative type of skills, client management. So, recognizing that there is a different skill set, it can be totally fine to bring other resources into those roles, but know that there's different skill sets, and then monitor it. I mean, especially early on in a program, we certainly try to work with clients to make sure that there's a good perspective on where their different category managers are starting from in terms of their skill sets and how they're adopting, and then to keep a close eye on that as they're developing to see are there specific development needs, or in some cases, as you find out with every client situation, there are some individuals that just aren't suited to the category management role, and that's okay.
Yeah, I would add on to that just a little bit. I think those are all of the right points. Just looking at it from a slightly different angle, I think you have to think about the full spectrum of full body of work too. So, oftentimes organizations just rebrand everyone. You may have been sourcing managers one day and category managers the next, or buyers to category managers. The work doesn't go away that everyone was doing the day before. So having a distribution of work that makes sense. So maybe you're saying, some percentage of our team members are still going to handle the execution of the procurement activities, of sourcing activities, of some of the transactions, and here's what that looks like, and here are clear roles and responsibilities. And we're elevating some number of people to category managers and acknowledging we need to put some foundational elements around them to give them, the extra horsepower that they need in terms of the blended learning and the right tools and templates and help developing their portfolio and their roadmap and their category manager understanding. I think that tends to work well. And having a realistic set of expectations. So I don't expect you to be the best category manager in 6 months necessarily. I have that thoughtful, long-range approach to it. And not everyone can make the transition. So you have to have, solid expectations and then manage against them, measure success, and change your plan, much like a category strategy, change your plan as you go. But I think it's important to think about the work and what you're asking people to do and making sure it's clear, because oftentimes if you're comfortable doing a set of sourcing activities, for example, and now you've been branded a category manager, it's really easy just to go back to your comfort zone and execute those sourcing activities because it's what you know that you're good at it, it makes sense, it's not uncomfortable.
So as you start rolling out category management then, do you recommend that you don't necessarily go and try and cover all categories at the first bite of the cherry? You start to look at it a little bit iteratively. So you make a commitment to implement category management, but you focus on certain categories, and maybe you have some of those who have the strongest capabilities around, the softer skills. You put those in those roles first, and then you start to try and develop or hire to fit some other categories and introduce it on a kind of a category by category basis. How do you see the best way of actually starting to implement category management for the first time?
Well, it certainly starts as it's always a journey. It is a journey, and I think we said that from the beginning. And this is certainly the early stages of the journey that you're talking about. One of the things that we try to do early on, I think I mentioned this concept of a roadmap. is to, I think what you want to get into a position as quickly as possible is that you have an intentional approach, some intentional strategy across the majority of your categories, if not all your categories. And that intentional approach could be, we just don't have the bandwidth or the right category manager to address it this year, so we're going to just go business as usual and get it done. And then next year, we're going to focus on that category. Mm-hmm. But to build out an intentional roadmap across all your categories that map to your category managers that outline, which categories you're going to develop this year, which categories you're going to develop the next year and over the next several years to reach your ultimate objective.
And so one of the things I wanted to really touch on today was, we have category management in place, and this is what I've seen a lot of times, is you have it and, it does you go through the process for the first time, you identify a lot of low-hanging fruit or quick wins, and you're able to, justify the investment up front just by some cost savings. But then it's easy for it to kind of peter out. You have the first round of wins, but it's hard to sustain. And I think that's where a lot of companies kind of trip up, is how do we sustain this over the long term so that it starts to move as well from other value levers, not just cost. And, as we were doing some prep for today, you shared with me a roadmap, which I thought was just a really good visual, and I'll actually, include that in the show notes today. But I wonder if you could just talk through the life cycle, if you will. And I hesitate to use the word life cycle because I think it's a journey that never ends, but it's kind of a process which takes you from, well, we have category management for the first time, it's going to do certain things for us, but what do we need to start thinking about, and how do we need to evolve it so that it continues to remain relevant as we mature and as we start to, look at other areas that we can bring value?
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be a little bit daunting when you have a first conversation with someone about category management and you basically say it will never end and you'll always be on the journey.
Yeah.
It's not a real upbeat message sometimes, but I think we truly do believe that. And I think it's also part of what drives our passion and enthusiasm about thinking about category management and getting continually better in it and helping clients to do the same. And while there's not just kind of that stake in the ground where you say, now we're at the foundation and now we're at the next stage, I think there's a couple different ways that we've broken it up to think about a few key pieces of the journey. So it's starting, at a very basic foundational level to say, at that stage, you're really just figuring it out. You're defining roles. You're probably putting people in roles. You're getting some starting points around what does our category management process look like? What are the tools and templates that we need? What does an entry level or a first pass at a roadmap look like? How do we start thinking about the activities that we're doing as a portfolio, as a procurement portfolio, not just I have a sourcing project and it needs to get done tomorrow, but as a whole portfolio of activities that we're balancing and prioritizing as we go. We're getting those key steps in place that we talked about earlier around the governance, the communication plan, the change management. What happens when we need to make a change, or how do we know, how we're progressing against what we expected to be able to do? We might be getting some initial category councils started. So it's some of those core foundational pieces just to start to get people comfortable being a little bit uncomfortable, to be honest, and to start making people think about category management first before they just can go back to being used to what you're doing.
Right.
You're probably even meeting stakeholders for the first time and starting to map those out to say, when I do get to the point where I have a category plan in this area, here's who I'm going to talk to, and I've now met them and I understand them and I know a little bit about their role. So it's all of those starting point elements that you have to get through to, again, lay that foundation and to think about those first steps.
Once you have that foundation built, then how can you make sure that you can kind of sustain it and take it to the next level?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think, we just talked about a lot of different pieces. It is really easy if you get through a number of those to kind of wipe your brow and say, wow, that was great. We did that.
Right.
And we generated, to your point, some quick wins. Let's take a breath. Let's pause. We're kind of tired from all this running. We're going to take a break. So it's very easy to get all of that done and all those great foundational pieces down and then ultimately fall back into old habits or not progress. So we really think about them pushing the envelope one step further and getting it to be sustained and getting to that sustainable category management mindset, category management process. So at that level, you're you're running faster, unfortunately. You're not taking a break. You're starting to more consistently apply. So not only do I understand the tools and templates, but I'm starting to know which ones to bring in at the right time. I'm starting to understand just how to do some of the things I'm being asked to do as part of my job. I'm getting some of those vision statements to be a little smarter, a little more measurable, a little more detailed. I'm linking those to kind of the key things that we're going to do in our portfolio. Probably improving some of the enablers, because a lot of times as you run faster, you realize, gosh, we need better spend visibility, or we need better training to enable these skill sets. So there are a lot of pieces that are coming along with that. But you're really just making it more a part of what we do first and foremost versus that forced thought process that you were probably doing at the foundation level. Right. And you're really just getting more and more entrenched with your stakeholders as you go, and more entrenched with the business. So the business is now starting to realize this is just the way they engage with procurement, and procurement does start to have a seat at the table. All of that obviously then leads to that third piece that we think about on the journey, which is really optimizing and scaling. So a lot of times, for example, category management might really embed itself in a particular region, or it might be global, but everyone's still thinking in a regional mindset, for example, or just doing strategies and planning with their local stakeholders that they can look at kind of face to face. So, when you reach scalability, you're really collaborating. It's fully baked into the business plan. You have seats at the table when you think about budgeting, for example. Categories that lend themselves to global strategies are really driving toward those global strategies. And really, this is where, as you start to become more advanced, procurement might really be a key figurehead or a key player in bringing global stakeholders together and getting some of those silos to break down as well. I'd say the category councils, things like the change management and governance, just become part of organizationally the way you do business, and the way procurement is thought as a change agent, as a contributor to the overall business value. And even within that, then there's a lot of different opportunities to continue to improve. I think oftentimes based on a company's culture and background, they might be naturally better at some of these things than others, and so there's always room to improve as long as the organization is thoughtful around, this is, on the maturity curve, this is where we want to be. This is where, we want to invest in procurement to this level, and they're working to attain that level of maturity or that level of mastery, if you will.
So I had a couple of questions. One of them was, does each category have to be at the same level, or are you looking at investing in different categories, and bringing them to different points of the journey? So, for example, something that's really material to the success of the business, you'd want to have it at a more mature state as something that may be more just commodity based. It's all about its continuation of supply, as opposed to trying to bring out innovation and supply based innovation.
Yep, I think you're thinking about it spot on, in the sense of, what we just walked through as a journey is really where category management as a whole should go, or where we see that going. But within given categories and subcategories, there should be educated decisions around what the right maturity level is for engagement in that category. So you're right, if it's not core to the business, and if the spend is small, and it can reach a point where you decide this is the right level of maturity or investment in that area, and this is the amount of time that it makes sense to spend in it, versus something else that is core to the business. It crosses multiple product areas. It's global. It has a lot of complexities to it. You're going to want to spend more time. You're going to want to spend more time with those stakeholders. You're going to want to know that market deeper and ultimately deliver the right value for that area.
Yeah, you think about there's multiple dimensions would go into the maturity of a category. You think the organization itself has history with the given spend category. And again, you would expect a lot of your direct materials categories to have had much more historical focus than, say, indirect. But it also depends on the individual category manager who's managing that particular spend category. It also depends on the market and the specific situation for that category. So one of the things that we've developed, we've found to be pretty powerful, is a little maturity model to help, at a high level, think about those factors. So when you're at the beginning of your category planning process, every category manager can just think candidly about where are you with this category, not for the sake of measuring them, but just so that you're taking the appropriate next steps when you're building out your plan and you're setting your objectives for what that plan is going to achieve.
And so, Lynn, you alluded to something just when we were talking through the roadmap about the fact that as you start to mature, you need additional investment. So the additional investment can be in tools because you suddenly need a stronger data analytics tool, for example. Or it can be in people because you need to continue developing your people and maybe you need a different skill set as you transition from one phase to the other. Are there typical trigger points, where an organization says, well, this has worked so far because of these returns I've got, that makes me more comfortable to invest in developing the capabilities going forward? Yeah,
I think that's true. I think as category management becomes more embedded in the business and it starts to show that it's practicing what it preaches, that it really is about meeting business objectives and driving optimal business value, I think those conversations become easier and easier, and I would also say more and more innovative, because I think oftentimes there can be a list of easy portfolio wins, for example, or easier projects that we all can nod and say, yep, it makes sense to do this, or these are the right things for procurement to focus on. But if you really push the envelope and if you're really trying to drive maximum value, there are some more innovative ideas that procurement can start to bring to the table and start to talk through with the stakeholders. And if they have really good, strong relationships and they have a track record of, again, doing what they say they're going to do and thinking about the business objectives first and foremost, I think really transformed organizations can start to drive some really interesting things and really interesting partnerships where procurement's bringing new ideas and really driving value that before just wouldn't have been possible.
Right, we wouldn't even be able to have the conversation.
Exactly.
Hi there, it's Phil here. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we're actually going to continue this discussion on episode 97. So if you're listening to this on the day it's released, that's going to be in 3 days' time. We'll then switch focus to the perspective of the category manager and the recommendations that Lynn and Chris make to help category managers achieve better outcomes from their category strategies. So until then, I will talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.